Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar entitled Enabling the Implementation of Adaptation Plans. I'm Cameron Hunter, a policy analyst at the International Institute for Sustainable Development, which serves as the Secretariat for the Prairie's Regional Adaptation Collaborative, or PRAC. For those of you who haven't heard of the PRAC before, it's a cost-shared program between the governments Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, and Natural Resources Canada. The PRAC aims to increase the capacity of government and civil society decision makers on the prairies to understand, prepare for, and take action to adapt to climate change. Today's webinar is the final one in the PRAC's series of virtual events focusing on building climate resilient communities on the prairies. Over the past 6 weeks, we have held webinars that have examined how communities are increasing their climate resilience by building back better after extreme weather events, establishing resilient food systems, and using creative approaches to bring diverse voices into adaptation planning processes. Through these events, we have heard about the importance of proactive adaptation planning and how engaging with your community and ensuring diverse perspectives are included adds value to the adaptation planning process and establishes community buy-in and support. To view the recordings from all of the webinars in this series, as well as other PRAC webinars, please visit our website at prairiesrac.com. Today's webinar focuses on how municipalities on the prairies are working to put their adaptation plans into practice. While this event is being held virtually, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm currently in Winnipeg, which is located in Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. I would now like to turn the webinar over to our moderator for this session, Joellen Perry, Director of Adaptation in Canada with IISD's Resilience Program. Joellen, over to you.
Thank you, Cam, and welcome everyone to today's webinar. As Cam mentioned in his introduction, the goal of the PRAC is to promote planned adaptation to the changes in our climate that we're witnessing today and that we anticipate will take place in the future. In its current phase, the PRAC has given particular attention to the adaptation planning needs of the numerous communities located across the prairies. We know that an increasing number of municipalities are making the effort to assess their climate risks and then develop adaptation plans. The next challenge becomes taking the steps needed to put these plans into action, to transform the words that are on the paper into meaningful actions on the ground. Moving from the planning stage to the implementation stage of the adaptation process is not necessarily an easy thing to do. It requires establishing institutional arrangements that can enable collaboration across different departments, accessing the data, analysis, and information needed to make sure that decisions are made in an informed manner, increasing the capacity of people to understand and integrate climate change adaptation into plans and processes, finding the money to pay for new initiatives, either by redirecting existing budgets in new directions or by finding new financing, and establishing systems to monitor and evaluate adaptation actions taken to see what is working and where changes are needed. Today, in this final session of the PRAC's 2021 webinar series, we're going to examine the current progress municipalities are making across the prairies with respect to adaptation planning and implementation. We're going to look at the challenges and opportunities that they are experiencing and the different ways in which municipalities are increasing their climate resistance by implementing their adaptation plans. The session will be a combination of presentations and moderated discussion, and there will be an opportunity, of course, for you to raise questions with all of the presenters at the end. Throughout the sessions, please type your questions into the Q&A panel. Please feel free to direct your questions to a specific panelist or to anyone who would be the best place to provide an answer. We'll try to get to every question. We're going to start today's webinar by hearing from someone that's likely not a stranger to you, Dr. Dave Sauchyn. Dave is the director of the Prairie Adaptation Research Collaborative, or PARC, and a professor at the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies at the University of Regina. Among his many activities, Dave recently served as lead author for the Prairie Provinces chapter of the Regional Perspectives report prepared as part of Canada's National Assessment of Climate Change. He will be speaking about the report and its findings regarding the status of adaptation planning on the prairies, helping us to launch our discussion today. Dave, it's great that you could join us to be part of this discussion in this webinar series, and we're looking forward to hearing from you about the findings from the regional assessment.
Thanks, Joellen. It's great to be here. I'll turn off my email here so it doesn't beep. Hi, everyone. So if you can see my presentation, this cover slide is a bit of an inside joke. The fact that NRCan created two organizations with virtually the same acronym. And I thought since this is the last, last PRAC webinar, I would make the distinction one more time, because I think I've spent many hours telling people what the difference is between PRAC and PARC, and Cameron just told you what the PRAC does and what the PRAC is, and it facilitates adaptation planning on the prairies. Whereas, next slide.
Dave, can I just jump in for a second? I think you accidentally turned your webcam off there.
Oh, okay.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, no. I got a pop-up window asking me if I wanted my webcam. I thought that's strange. There we go. How's that?
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. I just don't want to look at myself. I'm looking at my slides and at myself, and I'd rather not see myself. There we go. I minimized myself. So so PARC, whereas the PRAC facilitates planning, PARC enables planning by doing science, climate science, and supporting science-based decision making. And we've done that for more than 20 years. So I'll just give you a couple of quick examples of current projects by PARC where we're providing data and information. And then at the end of my talk, I'll talk about how the climate services on the prairies have very recently been very much enhanced by the creation of Climate West. So here's one example, next slide. Current project we have, providing the City of Edmonton with high resolution climate projections. And I do mean, next slide, high resolution, because we are downscaling information from Earth system models to a grid of 3.3 kilometers. And this is dynamical downscaling. So this area is about 100 kilometers by 100 kilometers in central Alberta. It's centered on Edmonton. And a grid cell of this size is typical of a global climate model. So if you use global climate models, which most people do, you would get a single climate projection for this large grid cell. But we're giving the City of Edmonton thousands, more than 3,000 climate projections, because we're running a regional climate model on a supercomputer to downscale the global information down to a very local scale, the scale of neighborhoods. So when I mean neighborhoods, next slide. Here are some results. These are climate changes between the recent past and the near future on the left and the further future on the right. Each of these is a different month. So there's that single grid scale cell from a GCM, but the results here are downscaled. You can see in some months, and this is precipitation. In some months, there is a fairly uniform color, which means that, for example, in wintertime, throughout this area, they receive more or less the same amount of snowfall. But when you get into spring and summer, you get this modeling color because spring and summer rainfall can be quite variable over a distance of 100 kilometers, and we're able to capture that, even within the limits of the City of Edmonton. That polygon in the center is the city limits of Edmonton. And if you look, for example, at August and July, you can see that there's a difference in precipitation between the southern 2/3 of Edmonton. You can even see the river valley in terms of the difference in precipitation. So this is an example, and this project is not done, of giving a municipality very high resolution regional climate data. Next slide. Oh, and we're also working with the city and with EPCOR to look at daily river flows of the river at Edmonton. And so these are high flows. And if you go from 1950 on the left to 2100 on the right, there are higher and higher flows. There's a higher probability of flooding, but also the timing differs. You see all those brown and beige dots on the left? Those are high flows in the late summer and early fall as a result of the melting of the glaciers and the high elevation snowpack. Well, later in the century, there isn't much glacier ice and high elevation snowpack. And so now the high flows are occurring in spring and early summer as a result of snowmelt runoff. Next slide. And then another project that PRAC is involved in is the National Assessment of Climate Change. And I'm the lead author of the Prairie Provinces chapter, which was just released in December. Next slide. It's part of a national process, so there will be a whole series of reports. There'll be like 15 reports released over the next year and a half. The science report, Canada's Changing Climate, was released in April 2019. The very first regional report was the Prairies. There'll be a bunch more, and there'll be national issue reports, Indigenous reports, and so on that are coming out over the next year or so. Next slide. So the Prairies report was written by a whole bunch of authors, like 14 authors, and the first 3 are considered lead authors. But the contributing authors include a few people I want to mention, like Megan Van Ham, who works for the city of Calgary and wrote something on collaborative community-based water planning in Alberta. Twyla Kowalczyk wrote a really nice case study on flooding in the city of Calgary. But I want to highlight Kendra Isaac because Kendra is the person who wrote the section of the chapter on adaptation. And we were hoping she could give this talk, but that wasn't possible. So I'm a stand-in for Kendra. Next slide. Here's the table of contents, and you can see those case studies that I mentioned, plus a case study on the Fort Mac fire and so on. And we had 6 key messages. I'll just focus on a couple. I won't mention ecological, agricultural consequences of climate change, even though they are important. Next slide. But in terms of communities, perhaps the most important key messages, next slide, is first of all, extreme events. And I wrote this section of the report talking about how a warming climate is amplifying the extreme events. So the range between dry and wet is getting larger. The dry is getting drier, the wet's getting wetter. And yet we already have on the prairies the most variable climate in Canada and one of the most variable climates on Earth. Here's an indication of that. Here's the 10 most costly weather disasters since 1983. They've all been on the prairies. In fact, they've all been in Alberta. Because in terms of cost, there's much more exposure in Alberta. There's just many more people and more communities and bigger cities. So even though these events occur throughout the prairies, they're most costly in Alberta. And of the 20 most costly events, 16 have occurred on the prairies. Next slide. Next key message is about social groups and the fact that climate change exacerbates any existing social inequalities. So I'm sure your communities, especially the larger ones, have an Indigenous population, women, poor people, the youth, the elderly, and recent immigrants. And these people have unique vulnerabilities, but also some unique adaptive capacities because they have a different perspective than other social strata. Next slide. And then the key message that's most relevant here is that adaptation planning. And Kendra concluded that cities are at the forefront in the Prairie provinces, but that few of the plans have begun to assess future climate risk. They're based on an analysis of historical risks and weather data, and that very few plans have incorporated means of of monitoring the effectiveness of the adaptation plans. Next slide. And so Kendra went on to write that governments are slowly embracing adaptation planning. I suspect the municipalities don't feel that way, but scientists do. But that the leadership is coming from the municipalities, and yet we think they're still at the early stages. And that not only municipalities, but governments and corporations really have begun to disclose their climate risks, where their services and assets are at risk to climate change. Next slide. Because, after all, climate change really has become a business issue. If you want to read about climate change, read the business section of the Globe and Mail. I'm not kidding, on a daily basis, there's at least one article about climate change and how corporations are being told by their boards of directors they have to account for the risks due to climate change. And of course, that applies to municipalities as well. And that in order to do this, the workforce has to be upskilled. We have to teach a whole generation of planners, engineers, agronomists, biologists, and so on about climate change because they didn't learn about it in university. Next slide. So here's some examples that you people are well aware of, especially we're going to hear about Selkirk and Leduc, and in the center is the resilience plan for Saskatoon, and of course there are others, Calgary, Edmonton, and so on. Next slide. So we concluded the chapter with what we think are some knowledge gaps, including we need to know about the worst case scenario on the prairies, which will be when a multi-year drought reoccurs, because they do occur, but it's going to occur in a warmer climate. As I previously mentioned, we have to be able to assess the vulnerability and adaptive capacity of particular social groups who are most vulnerable. We have to incorporate Indigenous knowledge, and how do we do that? We have to look at what happens as the capacity or the potential for agriculture expands beyond the current extent of agriculture. So if we're going to practice agriculture in the north, what does that mean for the municipalities in that region? We need further guidance on how municipalities and other users use projections from climate models. We can give them the data, but then we have to tell them how to use it. There have to be best practices for the evaluation of progress that we're making towards achieving resilience. And finally, there are new opportunities for climate change, and we can't overlook those. Next slide. So finally, and I want to keep this presentation short so that we can hear from the other panelists and take questions and answers, but I have to mention Climate West, a brand new organization that's a partnership between PRAC, the Prairie Climate Center, University of Winnipeg, and ISD, also based in Winnipeg. And those are the core partners, but we will collaborate with other organizations that are capable of providing climate data, training, and information. And this organization was launched last month. It doesn't seem like it. We've been busy ever since. And our executive director, the only person who works full-time for Climate West, is Jane Hilderman. So she does all the heavy lifting. Next slide. Climate West was created with for the purpose of increasing access to data, because lots of it is out there, but there has to be mechanisms to access it and make it available in a user-friendly format, offer guidance on how to use the climate information, building capacity by offering training and learning opportunities. And we have a help desk where anybody can leave a message or call. And first of all, Jane will get back to you, and if she doesn't, she finds somebody who can. And finally, I think this is the last slide. Next slide. No, that was the last slide, because I just wanted to tell you about Climate West. Great. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Dave. It was great to hear from you and for you to be able to participate in this webinar. I am sure that your discussion has raised some questions within the audience. And so if anybody has any questions, please share them in the Q&A panel, and we'll come back to them later in the session. As Dave mentioned, the findings in the Prairie Provinces chapter provide a positive picture of how cities and smaller municipalities are leading the way with respect to planning for and taking action to meet the growing challenge of climate change. However, there's been a mix of experience across the prairies, and more work needs to be done to build the climate resiliency of villages, towns, the RMs, and cities located throughout the prairies. So at this point in time, I'd like to dive more deeply into the current state of municipal adaptation planning on the prairies by inviting Jeff Zukiwsky, the Director of Climate Change Adaptation and Resiliency at the All One Sky Foundation, to join us. Hi, Jeff.
Hello, Joellen.
Hi. Yeah, so for more than a decade, you've been working with communities across Canada, particularly in Alberta, to assess their climate risks and vulnerability, and to develop meeting and implement strategies to reduce these risks and take advantage of these opportunities. So I thought I'd just begin by asking you to tell us a bit more about the work that the All One Sky Foundation has been doing in the area of climate change adaptation planning on the prairies.
Sure. Yeah, we'll do. Thanks, Joellen. So I guess, yeah, I'll first just introduce myself. I'm a professional planner. I'm the Director of Climate Adaptation and Resilience with All One Sky Foundation. And yeah, my experience working in the field actually goes back to 2008. So in 2008, I was involved with a climate adaptation planning program in the Kootenays in BC. And we worked with Elkford and Kimberley, who were, as far as I know anyway, the first two municipalities in Canada to try to develop a climate adaptation plan. And that grew into a comprehensive program that was run by Columbia Basin Trust. And we worked with about 25 municipalities in BC and trying to help them develop climate adaptation plans. And I took what I learned there to Alberta and applied that with All One Sky Foundation, and we developed a program called Climate Resilience Express. And through that program, we were focused on helping smaller rural communities develop climate adaptation plans and help build capacity and implement plans if we could. So I've worked with about maybe 40 different municipalities, mostly in Alberta and BC. But yeah, that's my experience and my background.
That's great. So through the work that you have done with All One Sky, what's been your experience about when and why municipalities decide to undertake climate risk assessments and create adaptation plans?
Good question. I'd be curious to hear from Kerra and Megan on why they did it, but I would say there's, in my experience, probably there's two main things that I think seem to be driving that. The first thing is in response to some sort of event, right? So if you think about the big floods that happened in Calgary or in, I guess, all of southern Alberta in 2013. So that led to some responses from municipalities wanting to figure out how to account for climate change and create adaptation plans. So yeah, either in response to some event or else driven by a local champion. So in my experience, there's always been either a council person or a staff member in these communities that's leading the charge and decides that they want to develop a climate adaptation strategy for their community, and that's usually usually what drives the process.
And sort of reflecting on that experience and your other work, how much progress do you think that municipalities are making in terms of understanding the risks posed by climate change and developing strategies?
Yeah, good question. I know Dave touched on that a little bit, talking about some of and we're going to hear from some communities, but I would say in general, the larger municipalities in the prairies, Edmonton, Calgary, Saskatoon, Winnipeg, are all sort of have fairly robust climate adaptation plans in place, and they're taking steps to implement those plans. And there's sort of a handful of smaller communities. I think Leduc and Selkirk are probably the two leading communities in the prairies that are doing significant work around climate adaptation. Certainly fewer of the really small communities are doing it, and again, it's really driven by their limited capacity to take on a planning process like that, right? And I think most most staff in smaller communities are worried about fixing potholes and parking strategies, trying to figure out where people should be parking or dealing with building permits or applications or whatever. So it's one of those things where I think it's hard for a community with limited capacity to take on a planning process like that.
And so we have, as you mentioned, we have a small but growing number of communities on the prairies that have undertaken an assessment of their risks and have developed an adaptation plan, which is a significant accomplishment for many communities. There's always that risk that the plan is just going to sit on the shelf and collect dust. So what has been your observation regarding the challenges that communities are experiencing, either in terms of like getting the adaptation planning process going and then actually moving it from the planning stage into the implementation stage?
Yeah, well, that's the big challenge. And I think that challenge is not exclusive to climate adaptation planning or climate change planning, right? I think I experienced that exact same challenge, whether it's you're dealing with tourism and recreation planning or a sustainability plan or a forest management plan or whatever other type of plan a community creates. There's always that risk that it sits on the shelf and it doesn't get implemented. And I think, again, it goes back to that having somebody within the municipality, and whether that's a staff person or an elected official, that is the champion and is driving the process. I can't emphasize enough like how important that is to the communities I've worked with in my experience of being able to take the plan and actually do something with it. Yeah, I guess an external person, I mean, my role is I usually come in and facilitate a process and do a vulnerability risk assessment, help them create a plan, and then I'm gone. And so, yeah, it's one of those things that it's sort of up to the municipality to take it from there and make sure it gets implemented.
Okay. And you sort of mentioned this a bit within your earlier comments, but what do you see as being some of the key differences, having worked with the city of Edmonton, having worked with smaller communities like Turner Valley, in terms of the challenges that they experience in terms of developing and implementing their adaptation plans?
Yeah, it all comes down to how much time and money you have, right? So for communities like Edmonton, they obviously have access to more funding and more resources to be able to do that, and smaller municipalities are going to struggle. So yeah, I'd say that's the main difference. It comes down to funding and human resources to be able to get it done.
Great. Well, thank you, Jeff. I think now we're going to hear a bit from the communities of Leduc and Selkirk, but you're going to stay around to answer some questions later on?
I will.
Okay, great.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks. So as we discussed, there is a growing number of municipalities on the prairies that are assessing their risk and assessing the risk to their operations and identifying priorities for adaptation action. We're now going to hear from two people who are working to put their community's adaptation plans into action. And each should provide some insights into what has worked along the way, some of the challenges that they've experienced and the ways that they've overcome them. So our first presenter is Kerra Chomlak, who is the manager for environment at the city of Leduc in Alberta. And so Leduc worked with All One Sky to complete their climate and weather readiness plan in 2014. So Kerra, we're looking forward to hearing from you about Leduc's experience and some of the actions that you've implemented.
All right, well, thank you. Thanks, Joellen. So happy to be here to tell you a little bit about the Leduc story. Really appreciate these types of webinars, and thanks, Dave, again for explaining the difference between PRAC and PRAC, because I'll admit I've been to a few of your webinars and I just kind of figured that out today, that there was actually two different acronyms. But really appreciate Dave's informative presentations and how he can really translate that science into something meaningful and understandable for folks like us that are trying to explain to our stakeholders why this is important. So the Weather and Climate Readiness Plan for the city of Leduc started back, I'll get you to advance the slide if you don't mind, Catherine. Started back in 2000 when I joined Leduc. I was the first environmental staff person the city of 23,000 at that time had. We've now grown to 34,000 and happy to have grown the environment group from 1 person to 3 within the engineering and environment group. I think some of my colleagues might be on the webinar today, so thanks for that support. So what I was going to tell you about, just generally, like Jeff had asked to speak to why did we do the plan? How do you build that council support? And then go through some of the actions and the implementation approach and some lessons learned. The title you'll see there is the Weather and Climate Readiness Plan. And the reason we chose to do that was so that we could get the message across in a really practical way and not turn anyone off by just calling it a climate change plan. You know, that there's actually day-to-day implications for weather changes and then longer-term climate changes. And as a city, we need to be ready for that. Next slide. So Leduc back in 2010 had a good foundation for environmental initiatives with our environmental advisory board, but they're looking at pretty practical projects like annual Arbor Day planting of trees and our blue bag collection program I just started in 2008. And so this plan that, you know, this was my first job, make a plan for the city of Leduc and tell us all the things, you know, that we should do and what priority. And so we consulted the public, we consulted council, and we came up with this really comprehensive plan for all topics on environmental issues and how are we going to address climate change and climate adaptation planning. And so there is a section along with waste and water and land called energy and climate change. And that's where we said, you know, within the next 10 years, we'd better do a greenhouse gas reduction plan. But there's a section at the beginning of this environmental plan that says there's actually 3 priorities that you need to do before you even embark on the other ones. And we lumped in involving youth because we had heard that from the public and doing a backgrounder report to see our status. And we called it the Weather and Climate Readiness Planning Process needed to take place. And the reason why, you know, I had really advocated for doing that first was because we wanted to help everyone understand, including myself, you know, what were the actual implications of climate change for the city of Leduc. We don't have a big river running through us. We don't have a lot of surrounding forest where we have a lot of risks for those big disasters we've unfortunately heard about in, you know, Calgary and High River and Slave Lake and Fort McMurray. So there was a little bit of questions and, you know, a little bit of lack of understanding as to, you know, whether or not it was an important issue for us to address. Next slide. So we had to work with our council and tried to put together a mix of policy and pragmatic actions, try and identify 1 or 2 quick wins, lots of conversations, and then take a step-by-step approach. And I've talked a lot about baby steps as we move the environment program forward, and that's just really how you have to do it. It's a big challenge, lots to do, and it's going to take some time. Next. So one of the interesting, you know, topics that we started out with first was what are the risks? There's a picture of Telford Lake, our prized jewel in the city of Leduc. We could be faced with some brush fires. We could see a tornado, but it's one of the more unlikely scenarios. So what were the real risks? Next. So with the help of All One Sky Foundation, and we pulled together a bunch of different departments, came up with our matrix. So the ones in yellow there, freezing rain, extreme precipitation and flooding, those are the actions that we knew we could put as higher priority. And then some of the other ones, you know, it's good that we have a list, and we just can kind of work through the actions on the other ones as time and budget allows. Next. So this is the level of detail the plan goes into with the actions, the resources, and the time frame. So this example is the focus on extreme precipitation and flooding. So we have a number of actions listed there around maintenance in our stormwater, developing education programs, updating our IDF curves, and conducting assessments. We have like the potential costs that we could estimate and a time frame. And so, you know, when Joellen and Cam were asking me about, you know, speaking to the implementation of this plan, and I wanted to just be open and say, you know, this has been a challenge for us. When we took this to council, they said, you know, great plan, but you're going to have to come before council every year in the budget process, and we'll have to prioritize and kind of pick one or two things if budget allows. And so, you know, what we've seen emerge in terms of implementation is we've had to link these initiatives to other actions that were already going to happen and have been motivated or brought up by other drivers in the city of Leduc and other departments. So next slide. So some of the examples where this has happened is, you know, if we're talking about emergency preparedness, which in our report, I'll just show you here, it is a little bit dusty and it's sun faded and has stickies on it and notes all over it because it's now 7 years old. But, you know, we do have actions on all of these things. And so my point is under emergency preparedness, working from home, protecting vulnerable populations and dealing with pests, we had to just kind of build off the good work that was already happening in the city. So for example, the fire department does put out emergency preparedness education packages for the community. And, you know, we found our role being just like a support in a way to kind of be a champion and like hold up the report and say, hey, great, that's also in our adaptation plan. So, you know, you should continue to do that. And it's important that we keep putting resources towards that. And that happened with our work from home policy. Our adaptation plan said back in 2014, you know, you're going to have some ice storms coming our way. The Highway 2 runs right through Leduc. We better be prepared if people can't get to work. And sure enough, we got our work from home policy this year because of the pandemic. So it took a long time, but our plan was, you know, there to kind of be just one more good reason. Same with our summer games, having hydration stations for athletes and fans. And it was hot that weekend in 2016 when we hosted, and so it was just another link to say, and you know, this is something we should continue to plan for going forward. We're meeting next week with our FCS group on homelessness strategy, which is coming up in Leduc, and our role has been to kind of hold up our adaptation plan and say, yeah, we need to plan ahead for vulnerable populations because this kind of extreme weather is going to continue. And pests is another good example where you have some really practical examples that you can take to council to say, you know, we already have an elm scale problem. We should probably plan to fund that going forward and try and deal with that. So my last slide was just the lessons learned. So integrate with your emergency planners. There's already lots of good work happening in your communities, probably from the fire departments, and tailor the risks to your municipality, make it specific. Go step by step along the process. Link your implementation with other initiatives. Give some simple examples of importance to your community, and this is one where I'm thinking about it going forward, and we're having a review of our environmental plan next year with council, and I'm trying to think about how I'm going to frame some of these issues in a way that really makes sense to our community. So for example, I might reference Telford Lake and say, remember when a couple summers ago Telford Lake was really low levels and full of algae and you could see the weeds sticking out of it? that's what's going to continue to happen. So this is why we need to put resources and plan for these kinds of issues. And then we'll revisit the plan and assess new risks, because the new risks do emerge. For example, I want to make sure I put the financial component in the next version of this plan, right? You know, in insurance costs and that sort of thing. So that's all I had for the overview of the City of Leduc Weather and Climate Readiness Plan, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Great. Thank you, Kerra. It's great to hear about how it is that Leduc went about both developing this plan and how it is that you're taking steps in an incremental way to actually see the plan come to life. So I'd like to, at this point in time, just remind everyone in the audience that if you have any questions for Kerra or for any of the other speakers today, please add them into the Q&A panel in the GoToWebinar software, and we will answer them as soon as we can. So our next speaker today is Megan Zukiwsky, who is responsible for asset management and GIS in the City of Selkirk in Manitoba. So Selkirk completed its climate change adaptation plan in 2019 in collaboration with the Prairie Climate Center. And so Megan, just turn it over to you to speak about your plan.
Great, thank you. Hi everyone, my name is Megan Zukiwsky and I'll be presenting on behalf of the City of Selkirk. I am the Asset Management and GIS Technician for the city. So I will be sharing with you our climate adaptation strategy and speaking specifically about how we're taking a paper strategy document and putting it into action in order to better prepare our community for the anticipated future climate. So we can go to the next slide. So I think we're maybe one ahead there. I'll just give a quick, yeah, perfect. So in 2018, the City of Selkirk was awarded grant funding through FCM's Climate and Asset Management Network Group. This is a program that offered peer learning opportunities, training, and funding to Canadian municipalities to help integrate climate change and sustainability goals into decision-making and future infrastructure planning. Out of 19 communities selected, the City of Selkirk was the smallest and only participant from Manitoba. So as a part of this opportunity, we partnered with local climatologists and the experts at the University of Winnipeg's Prairie Climate Center to develop our climate adaptation strategy. The climate science that we used for this plan came from the Climate Atlas of Canada, which is a really amazing online resource for community-focused climate data. So if you hadn't gotten a chance to explore that resource for your community, I would really recommend it. Our climate adaptation strategy identifies the likely impacts that climate change will have on municipal service delivery for the City of Selkirk and presents several adaptation actions and activities that can be implemented to ensure that these services do not go interrupted in the future based on climate. So next slide, please. So one of the challenges to successfully implementing any plan or new strategy is how it gets mainstreamed into pre-existing business and government systems. So to overcome this challenge, the City of Selkirk does strategies a bit differently than other municipalities. Each of our program level strategies contains a tactical item list, which you can see on the slide here. A tactical item is really just a discrete project that can be budgeted for in terms of resources and funding and be planned for in terms of timelines and have an end goal for completion. So each of these tactics that were identified are really how we move the strategy from the paper document that gets put on a shelf and put it into action. So this is the tactical item list from our climate adaptation strategy, and this is really the core of what we wanted to get out of the strategy. It has 12 documented tactical items and associated with each of those discrete projects. The tactical item list identifies the adaptation actions that were identified in the strategy as a potential response to a high risk consequence that was identified throughout our workshops. So one example of these tactics is to establish a street tree program. So this project is going to include the development of policies, procedures, and budget allocation to guide and facilitate the planting and maintenance of trees along any municipal right-of-way. So this tactic integrates 7 different adaptation actions, and it will address several different climate change consequences. For example, it will help us battle an increase in heat stress due to frequent and intense heat waves. And in addition, it will help us kind of combat basement flooding due to frequent and intense rain events. So we'll move to the next slide. This is just a quick overview of the city's business planning process and how the tactical items that come from any of our strategies, and specifically the climate change adaptation strategy, get integrated into the day-to-day activities of the city. So as soon as a strategy is passed by council, it officially becomes a part of the city's long-term business planning process. To achieve this, each of the tactical items that were listed get a tactical worksheet completed for them. And this is the process that the city uses to put strategic plans in line with and integrate it into annual budgets and financial planning. So once the tactical worksheet is approved, it becomes a part of the business plan, and it is no longer only, it's not only one person's responsibility and there's multiple owners, it becomes the responsibility of the entire organization at this point. So this allows for each of the tactics to adequately be planned and budgeted for throughout the whole life cycle of the project. Since our strategies are often long-term documents, for example, our climate change adaptation strategy is a 10-year strategy, incorporating all of the tactics into our long-term business planning process is one way to ensure that projects don't fall off the side of someone's desk. And it also is how these kind of projects survive people change. So if a tactical item is in the business plan, it becomes a part of the organization's future, and it can't just get removed because the champion of the project has retired or won the lottery. So we'll move to the next slide. So in addition to being added to the long-term business planning process, several tactics from the climate change adaptation strategy were linked to the city's asset management program through a risk management policy. So our asset management program takes a service delivery approach to better help us understand and manage our infrastructure. And a part of managing our infrastructure is to ensure that the new assets that we're investing in now will be suitable for future climate change. I actually attended a conference earlier this week, and I heard somebody say the phrase "build back better," which is really common in asset management and climate change conversations. But then somebody corrected them and suggested that maybe a more accurate phrase to use is to build smart from the start. So I think that's really what we're trying to do now with all of our infrastructure projects going forward. I think it's a really great way to shift the conversations from building better than we had before to building smarter for the future based on the science and the resources that we have now, because we already are aware of the problems that we're going to face in the future. So by integrating, or this is what we're trying to do by integrating climate change into our asset management program and in all service areas. So by integrating climate change adaptation into each of the service areas, we're eliminating the potential to have to choose between an infrastructure project and an adaptation project. We never want to get into the situation where we're putting those two kind of decisions against each other. We want to make sure that all infrastructure projects that are put forward have been considered with that climate change lens. So we're really planning for the long term, and you can kind of summarize it by plans, pipes, and trees. So I'm going to move into the next slide here to just show a couple of examples of how we are doing this. So we're starting to put our climate change adaptation strategy into action. And so there's two major projects that we are starting with. So the first one is the tree inventory. So on the left-hand side here, we completed our street tree inventory this past summer. So this is basically a map of every street tree that's located on city property. And this was done over 3 years. And so based on this, we are developing our street tree policy, which is prioritizing different street segments that will be receiving new trees in the future. And this prioritization is going to be taking into consideration information that came from our climate change strategy. So we're using trees to better manage stormwater in areas that have frequent overland flooding due to rain, as well as areas with few trees now, so that they can be used to cool the surface infrastructure in times of extreme heat, which are two events that we know we're going to be facing in the future. So on the right-hand side of the screen here is just a picture of a flooded street, but this is something that we experience often in Selkirk in times of heavy rainfall. So as an adaptation to climate change, we're prioritizing the separation of our storm and wastewater sewers. So basement flooding has been a problem for Selkirk residents in the past, and with predicted increase in the frequency and intensity of summer storms, it's going to be an ongoing risk. So by separating our storm and wastewater, we're better managing stormwater and decreasing the likelihood of these sewer backups in times of extreme rain. So I think that's really all that I've got on examples here for us today, but I will be around for questions as well. I think we're going to be going into some Q&A.
Great. Thank you, Megan. That was very, very interesting. You know, Selkirk's not too far away from where I'm sitting here in Winnipeg, and it was good to see the actions that you're taking to increase your climate resilience. So I'm going to invite Megan, Kerra, and Jeff to come back and online, and Dave too. And I just have just a couple of questions that for Megan, Kerra, and Jeff. So one of the things that I was struck by in hearing about the experience of Leduc and the one experience of Selkirk is kind of the difference between the extent to which efforts to implement your adaptation plans were strategic and versus sort of opportunistic. And I'm wondering if you could speak, Megan, like Selkirk has a very much regimented and planned approach, and is wondering about the extent to which you've also been able to take advantage of those emerging opportunities, which seems to be more of the way in which Leduc has been approaching its implementation of its plan.
Yeah, so I think what really has helped us is the fact that our asset management program is growing so much right now, and one of the champions of our asset management program is also a champion of and kind of a leader of climate change adaptation. So he really pushes each of the independent service area leaders to think of everything with that climate change lens. And in addition to that, our business planning process, it is very structured, and so there's not really an opportunity for any tactics that come out of any strategy to kind of fall off the side of someone's desk. So I think the combination of those two, having it documented in a structured process, as well as having that champion, he is our CAO, so it's a very high level champion. I think that really helps to make sure that everything that is considered as a capital project really does have the future in mind.
So for all of you, we know that when we're moving to implement adaptation plans, it's really important to have the backup of different parts of the municipal government as well as the city councillors, and so that requires communications and engagement. And I wondered if any of you would be able to share some of the tips or tricks in terms of how it is that you've brought different parts of the municipal government on board in terms of the adaptation planning process.
I can take a crack at it if you want, Joellen. So in Leduc, we started the conversations with council and the public on the overall environmental plan and did a big public consultation that way. And then the weather and climate readiness plan was more of a internally focused. That was one way of making it manageable and within budget. But I did get the opportunity to present with our mayor in a couple different forums in the region. So I think Jeff and the province had helped set up a workshop in Leduc, and there were, I don't know how many people were there, maybe like 50 to 80, and like a whole bunch of different municipalities, and it was just a good opportunity to, you know, talk to the mayor at the time, Greg Krischke, and say, you know, this is, people are looking at this planning now, and we have a chance to be a leader here. And we had the philosophical discussion about like whether a city should spend money on planning for disaster, or, you know, what the province's role is, because there is definitely a sentiment out there about, you know, disaster planning. The cost of a disaster will be covered by the province. We declare a state of emergency and it'll be covered. But where we ended up after we got the plan talking about, yeah, there are some disasters that could happen in Leduc, but it's all those low level costs that won't go away, replacing trees and, you know, looking at the size of our storm ponds and that kind of thing. That's going to be in our budget, and it is our responsibility as a municipality to take that on. And it's just prudent planning to be aware of these risks for our citizens. And so once we kind of, you know, figured out that there are smaller risks that are, it's not just about disaster and extreme weather, it's about, you know, the effect on the municipality, then I think we had more of our council on board.
Can I just comment on that, Joellen?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Sure. I guess in our experience, one thing that's been really effective in getting not only council on board, but also other staff members that sort of might be skeptical is having a really good climate science person, right? So Dave Sauchyn's not always available, so we actually we have a local guy we used in our work in BC and Alberta. His name was Dr. Mel Reisner, and he's a guy that's just able to present climate science information in a way that's really easy to understand. And we have experiences going into these small communities across Alberta where you have people sitting around the table with their arms crossed like this, and like, oh, I don't know why we're here, and this is like, we don't need to plan for climate change. And you know, Mel does his presentation explaining weather and climate and the historic data, and we're drawing on existing information from your community, and here's what it looks like. And yeah, 20 minutes later, they're high-fiving each other and talking about how they need to make action on climate change, right? So I think having being able to present and articulate that kind of complex scientific information in a really simple way that people understand what it means for them and what it means for, hey, like when you build a road, you know, the asphalt has a temperature threshold, so why don't you think about what that threshold is and maybe choose the asphalt type that is going to be resilient to the climate of the future. And so just make it like really real for people. I think that helped.
And at this point in time, I'd just like to remind everyone, I'm going to ask one more question, then we're going to turn it over to questions from the audience. So if anybody wants to raise a question with any of the panelists, please type your question into the Q&A box, and we will get to it soon. So yeah, my final question actually is just for anyone on the panel about, if you were having to give one piece of advice to another community that wants to start or to implement their adaptation plan, what piece of advice would you give to them?
I can start if you want. So I kind of hinted at it, but I guess, and it goes back to what I just talked about, is that municipalities are already doing a lot of things to plan for climate risks, right? Like managing your stormwater system and your water supply network and your trees. And so I guess I think if there was one piece of advice I would give to everybody, it's just that whenever you make a decision, especially a decision about like long-term, your economy, your infrastructure, community development, like any of those decisions that have that have some sort of a climate influence, you just need to look to the future. Look just like you would look, you know, if you're planning the future growth of your community, you would look at your future population projections, right? And see, well, if we're expecting to have X number of additional people in our city, then we need to plan for that and figure out where they're going to live. So it's the same thing with climate change, right? So if you look forward and say that, well, the climate projections in 2050 are going to be this, then we just need to use that information when we make decisions today to help us be more resilient for tomorrow.
Joellen, from the perspective of having met and worked with a lot of municipalities, it seems fairly important that to be, and Jeff referred to this, there'd be a champion in the administration. And of course, the higher the level, the better. I mean, Edmonton is a prime example where I met with city council, I don't know, 10 years ago, and there was this new councillor who was talking about a green strategy for Edmonton. And somebody said, well, what if Edmontonians don't like it? And he goes, well, I was born and raised here. I'd have to leave. I don't want to live in a community like that. And it was Don Arvidsson, who then became mayor, right? He's prepared to leave Edmonton, his hometown, if they don't buy into a green plan. And I've been asked, to speak to communities like, I got invitation from Grand Prairie. Grand Prairie, it never occurred to me they would want to do any kind of environmental planning, but there was a person on council who was progressive, right? And Viking, Alberta, I have cousins in Viking. I thought, doesn't strike me as a progressive community, but there was a single person on town council who thought this needed to be done.
I can just echo all of those. Same thing with us, Dave. We had one really progressive counselor, and yeah, this concept of a champion and moving that forward, and the local science guy, and looking at your future projections. And Megan, I really liked your Selkirk's approach of like linking it into asset management, because that's like something that is like, it's tangible, it's accepted that municipalities need to do this. And if you can kind of integrate with those existing processes and existing initiatives, like I had said before on some of our other examples, like that's the way to go, because there's just so many topics that climate adaptation cover that, you got to come at it from both angles. You got to come at it from like, we're planning for climate change, and you got to come at it from like, and everything we do should already naturally address this important issue.
I think planning for the future climate really is infrastructure, because that's how you deliver your services, right? So you need to have that climate lens on anything that you do. But in terms of what I would say to a municipality who's maybe hesitant to starting out or don't think that they have the momentum behind them, I would maybe just suggest to just get started and don't necessarily worry about having a whole plan perfect the first time around, because it's not going to happen like that. And so if you take baby steps, which is exactly what Kerra was saying, that's, I think, really the best way to start, especially if you don't have necessarily a high level champion.
Great. Well, I think that those are all very helpful hints for people who are at different stages in the adaptation planning process. And so now I think we'll move into the Q&A with the audience. And so I'm going to turn it back over to Cameron for this section.
Thanks, Joellen. So just a couple questions from the audience. Maybe the first one I'll direct towards Dave Sauchyn. There have been a few comments about assessing vulnerability to future climate changes. How would you factor in the inevitable socioeconomic changes that will also come with climate change, as this is crucial to determining vulnerability?
That's a really good question. And I'm not a social scientist. If I could, I would direct that question to Deborah Davidson, because I have to acknowledge that Deborah, and with the help of Amber Fletcher and Maureen Reed, wrote the social science section of our Prairies report. However, the approach that climate scientists take is we have to somehow develop scenarios of future economy and development. In order to drive these climate models into the future, we have to feed them with greenhouse gas emission scenarios. And so, led by the IPCC, starting in the 1990s, there has been a whole sequence of these different generations of these socioeconomic scenarios, because you can't possibly predict the future climate unless you know how much more greenhouse gas we're going to produce and how much more we are going to modify the climate. But that's probably the hardest. I think the physics is simple compared to predicting what people are going to do.
Science is easy, physics is simple.
Yeah.
Cameron, do you mind if can I add to that?
Absolutely, Jeff.
Yes, because we've done this kind of work when we did a climate change risk and vulnerability assessment for Edmonton. And so one of the things they asked us to do, which I think is important, is so both look at future climate change and then also look at, we incorporated it into their, it's called their city plan. So it's basically looking at Edmonton in the future where they're going to have 1 million more people. And so and this goes back to what I was saying about, looking at future demographic information as well. So Edmonton city plan says we're going to have 1 million more people. Where are we going to put them? How are we going to design our transportation network? Where are we going to do protected areas? And so when we did a vulnerability risk assessment for them, it was through that lens of how they saw the city in the next 50 to 100 years in terms of population growth and social issues and all sorts of things. So yeah, it's essential to, if you're projecting the future, you obviously want to also be thinking about the future of your community growth and development and your economy and all those things as well.
Thanks, Jeff, for that follow-up. Our next question is directed at Kerra. And Kerra, you mentioned that your strategy links with an objective of addressing homelessness, which is critically important. The question is just asking, I'm wondering if there are other groups that were identified in the plan as needing kind of particular attention.
Great question. So this weather and climate readiness plan from 2014, it doesn't necessarily talk about homelessness. It talks about vulnerable populations and that we need to plan ahead for that. And our Family and Community Support Services group has, taken on this objective of having a homelessness strategy. And so this is just an example where it was their initiative, and we just chimed in and said, great, we also think that's important. And you're going to have more extreme cold and more extreme heat. And it's not just homeless populations, it's seniors. And are they going to be, able to manage extreme heat if there's no air conditioning in their apartment and stuff like that? And so we just kind of add to the conversation and be a support and cheerleader for the work that they're doing.
Perfect. Thanks so much. This question's for Megan. Have there been any attempts to integrate Selkirk's adaptation strategy into land use planning bylaws for Selkirk and the planning district that you're a member of? If so, was this an easy process or were there any issues that came up?
So we have identified several bylaw and land use planning changes in our climate adaptation strategy, but they have not been implemented yet. So it is kind of in the works. I can't really speak to specifics about the impacts on Red River planning because I don't work closely with them. That's mostly our economic development department, but we are looking at developing bylaws that kind of dictate the amount of impermeable surfaces, for example, in new developments. In addition to that, the number and the type of trees that developers are required to plant in a new development going forward to make sure that there aren't palm trees getting planted in new developments, because we know that that's not going to be suitable for our future climate. So those are some of the considerations that we have thought about and we've worked in as tactics, but we haven't necessarily completed the execution and the implementation of those yet.
Perfect, thank you. This next question, maybe I'll direct to both Jeff and Dave. I think both of you might be able to address it. It's asking if there is a software or a skill that is important to learn to manage how you're integrating climate data sources into your kind of community services and planning.
I don't think there's a single piece of software, but certainly you have to understand some basic principles about how the climate changes. And unfortunately, very few people get exposed to those. I know that because I'm teaching the climate change course at our university this semester. We have 16,000 students. There's 10 students in my class. So I know that we're graduating all kinds of planners and engineers and policy analysts and agronomists and ecologists who don't know anything about climate change. But they're going to be told when they get into the workforce that they're going to be tasked with doing adaptation plans. So, you know, we're working right now with Climate West. That's one of the major, I guess, responsibilities of Climate West is to provide training resources. And I know there's other organizations that are doing the same thing. We have a lot of catch up to do, and it's to tell people the appropriate way of using climate data and to understand climate change. There's a lot of misunderstanding. And I can't fault people. They don't have the proper training.
Yeah, and I guess I could just I echo Dave's comment there. I'm not familiar with any software that you can use for that per se. I mean, I know sort of building off what Kerra and Megan talked about. I mean, I think the goal is, in my mind anyways, to try to mainstream these decisions, like mainstream climate change into the decisions you already make about infrastructure and about planning. And so I suspect they probably have a software tells them how to, you know, how big of a storm pipe they need, for example, right? So that's an example of where, well, let's plug the climate change projections into that existing software that you already have and try and come at it that way.
If I could just add one thing to that, it's not a software, but in our planning process for the development of our strategy, we did include frontline service workers from every service area that we delivered, so that when we did have the climate experts in the room, they could kind of translate the climate science and talk about what that would mean for our climate. And then the frontline workers were there to kind of interpret how that would impact service delivery. And so it was really beneficial to have all of a representative from each service area so that we could translate what the increase in temperature could mean for each service area and how it would change how we have to deliver the service as a municipality. The frontline workers identified things that if we just had management level staff, we would never have even factored in our strategy at all.
Yeah, that's a very interesting example, Megan. Thank you. The next question is for Megan and Kerra. They've noted that there are a couple places, the commercial zoned area in Leduc that will suffer from heat events and storm events, and in Selkirk, the flood streets, where nature-based solutions might be one option. So for example, on-site rain gardens was the example given. So their question is, are there any examples of Leduc or Selkirk implementing nature-based solutions in kind of their adaptation actions?
Generally in Leduc, we do promote tree planting as a nature-based solution. Pollinator gardens are a big one for us. Our environmental board's big on promoting that even in your own yard. We've had some businesses in the industrial area that have talked to us about, like, we want to do something, we don't know what to do, and if they can't build a pollinator garden out front of their business, they've actually asked us for land near Telford Lake so that they could contribute to some sort of nature-based solution within the city boundaries.
Yeah, and for Selkirk, this is another way that we link our asset management program with our climate change adaptation strategy, because our asset management program identifies the prioritization of natural asset infrastructure and green infrastructure if it can provide the same level of service that we're committing to currently. So that comes as a tactic from both our climate change strategy and our asset management strategy. And so there's a few ways that we're going to do this. The first that we've started with is the trees. So using that to manage excess overland rainwater, and then also using ditches where we can, as opposed to LDS or land drainage networks, especially because we're so close to the river. There's that opportunity to kind of divert that rainwater from going through our wastewater treatment system and moving it elsewhere through the use of natural assets.
The next question is, again, I think both for Kerra and Megan. Has either Leduc or Selkirk done much work on engaging with businesses in their community to do their own climate adaptation and resilience planning? Do you have any tips that you could give someone who might be kind of struggling to engage with the business community?
I hope you have something to say on this, Megan, because I don't really, because, you know, like I said, we focused our plan on our internal operations, and it was a way of scoping it so that we could manage it. But we have acknowledged the gap there about getting out to the broader community to talk about adaptation or weather readiness and climate readiness. And we haven't got there yet in terms of like an official city-led information campaign on that.
We're pretty much in the same boat when it comes to that. We haven't really worked in partnership with any specific businesses, but as a result of many of the tactics that are coming out of the strategy, there is potential there to work in collaboration. And so, yeah, at this point we haven't, but there's definitely that opportunity there.
Cameron, do you mind if I just add to that? And I just say that, I mean, Dave was presenting on the work he's done with the city of Edmonton. I mean, I think in my mind, the city of Edmonton is really kind of one of the leaders in North America in terms of addressing climate adaptation. And and they actually have a corporate climate leaders program where they have businesses that sign up to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and address climate change. And I don't know where they're at right now, but we did help them try to integrate climate adaptation into that program. So it was going to become a corporate climate leaders program where they not only did greenhouse gas emissions and inventorying and reduction strategies, but also climate adaptation plans and implementation of those plans. So it's a good example.
Thanks, Jeff. Our next question, I'm wondering if the planning stages of Leduc and Selkirk included a cost-benefit analysis to help select the desired actions. Now that you're in the implementation phase, has there been any kind of reflection on how accurate the cost-benefit analysis was? And do you find that the cost-benefit analysis was helpful in kind of gaining support for the actions that are being implemented?
So we didn't use necessarily a cost-benefit analysis, but we did have an overwhelming number of potential adaptation actions that we gauged in terms of multiple different characteristics. So we based each adaptation action and prioritized them based on if they were how effective they were going to be to combating the consequence of climate change, how affordable, the feasibility, the acceptability within the community, equitability, and the flexibility of that solution. So we scored it based on those 7 characteristics as opposed to just cost. And our strategy is available on our website, and it does outline the process that we use to do that, and also identifies the characteristics that we used.
For us, we didn't get quite that far as Selkirk. We just outlined the cost. I would say we did a much better job in our 2019 greenhouse gas reduction action plan that Owen Sky also helped us with, which was costs and benefits of actions, and not just what your council needs to budget for, but what you can expect to see back over 10 years if you take these actions.
Thanks, Kira. This next question is a bit open-ended, so maybe I'll open it up to all the panelists to see if you have any advice or perspectives specific to how a rural municipality might kind of jumpstart their adaptation process.
Apply for grant funding. There's lots of different organizations that try and help municipalities do this kind of work, and I think a lot of it goes maybe a little bit underutilized. And so that's a great way to make council really happy, and it's a really great way to make a project, start a project, and then have a strict deadline for it as well.
Our experience has been there's a huge range in terms of the capacity of rural municipalities. We have some in Saskatchewan, some RMs in Saskatchewan with just a handful of people. And the best they can do is have a grader and a snowplow, right up to some, what do they call, Kerra metropolitan, like next to Saskatoon and so on. And so it really depends on the resources that they have and they can access. But obviously agriculture is going to be if it's a rural municipality, then agriculture is going to be a major factor. And that involves a whole different set of risks and vulnerabilities and opportunities when it comes to climate change. So usually when you're dealing with a municipal council, it's a bunch of farmers, right?
I can add to that if you want. Do we have time?
Yeah, go ahead, Jeff. Yes.
Sure. Yeah, I would say, so it's kind of strange advice for me to give as a planner, but for the most part, I recommend that especially rural municipalities not spend a whole bunch of time planning. And the reason I say that is because there's really a lot you can do without, like, most communities understand what their risks are without going through, multi-year planning processes and assessments. I mean, for the most part, you know what your risks are, and there's things you can do tomorrow to start reducing those risks, right? So I first of all, I think I wouldn't wait until you have a plan in place to start taking some action. And then also, if you're in Alberta, there's going to be a provincial program coming out right away to help you do a planning process. So that's something you can tap into through the Municipal Climate Change Action Center. If you're outside Alberta, then I don't know. Good luck.
Thanks, Jeff. Lucky Alberta, I guess, right? I think we are coming up against our time. So before I close, I just want to turn it back over to Joellen to see if she has any kind of final reflections or remarks.
Thanks, Cam. First, I have to give a sincere thank you to all of the speakers, Dave, Jeff, Kerra, Megan. It's been great hearing from you. I feel like you've each provided some really rich insights and that can help municipalities that are looking to either begin their adaptation planning process or are actually looking to implement the actions that they feel are priorities for them to do. I think that some of the things I took away from this conversation was the reflection on the importance of how Kerra said, hey, you need to have the plan, but you also need to have, to take advantage of those other opportunities as they come along, in terms of as you slowly but surely integrate climate change into the daily decision making across governments. Also like the importance of having a champion and to sort of get the process going, but then moving towards making sure that as you do mainstream climate change adaptation into decision making, you are reducing the risk that when a champion leaves, that the climate change adaptation actions will slow down or stop being implemented. And the critical need to sort of start where people are at and to understand the financial risks that are associated with climate change impacts. That for municipalities, it's not just the really big events, but it's those incremental changes and costs that are municipalities have to address. And that by thinking about what those risks are, you can start to plan now to reduce the cost that they will be incurred by the municipality over time. So yeah, I found it to be quite a great conversation. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joellen.
Thanks.
I just wanted to, take one opportunity here to say thank you to our speakers today and to everyone who attended. I hope that you enjoyed it. Today's event, as we've said before, is the final session in our Building Climate Resilient Communities webinar series. And for our next PRAC event, we're actually going to be changing gears slightly. So the current phase of the PRAC will be coming to an end in March of this year. And it's planned that this new climate service organization, Climate West, will be carrying forward a lot of similar activities to what the PRAC has done. So with the ending of the PRAC and the beginning of Climate West, we wanted to take an opportunity to reflect on the past 10 years of PRAC activities, but also look forward to future directions in adaptation on the prairies. We're really looking to get people's input on how we can continue to provide timely and relevant information to adaptation practitioners. So our next event, we're planning a webinar that will reflect on the PRAC's past, but we'll also look forward to its future. And we really would like your input. So I hope that you will send us a photo or a story before this event of a time in the last 10 years where the PRAC where you have engaged with the PRAC, or how being involved with the PRAC has helped your climate adaptation efforts. So you'll see the email address up on the screen. Please send me your photos or stories. We're really looking forward to looking back on the next 10 years, but also looking forward. Just a last minute housekeeping item. We have recorded today's event and we'll posting it on the PRAC website. There will also be a short evaluation survey that will open in a different browser tab as we close the webinar today. We would very much appreciate if you could complete the survey, as it helps us keep our future events to meet your needs and standards. Thank you again for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you in the future. Bye now.